Hey folks, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. Let's discuss retrograde planets in the natal chart. So in this video, we're going to be looking at a framework, some guidelines and some tools to help you to think about retrograde planets and your relationship with the retrograde planets in your chart. Now, obviously, not all retrograde planets in the chart will have the same significance. You know, all of this is qualified by the unique configuration of your chart and the aspects involved, etc. So retrograde planets, from our perspective here on Earth, appear to be moving backward. So when this phenomenon happens, we say that a planet is retrograde. So it's subtle, but important in that our conception of astrology is based on our perspective here as observers on the Earth. So when we cast a natal chart, we are looking at the configuration of planets from our specific place and time of birth relative to the sky. So our unique subjectivity becomes front and center in astrology, and it's simple but quite important in that this is saying that astrology is a dance between what is out there in sort of more objective terms and the state of our human consciousness. So the archetypes of the planets are in this sort of co-creative dance with our subjectivity and our consciousness as humans. And another example of this is that, you know, we all know that in objective terms, the sun and the moon are not the same size, but from our perspective here on Earth, they appear to be comparable in size. So in other words, the sun and the moon have equal places in human consciousness. And when we are interpreting a natal chart, we would be foolish to not acknowledge that the sun and the moon are of equal importance in our individual psychological wiring and makeup. Yeah. So retrogrades have to do with our observation from our standpoint here on Earth that planets, except the sun and the moon, occasionally slow down and they stop or halt, and then they change direction for a time, moving backward through the zodiac. So we know that objectively, planets never really slow down or move backward, but they appear to slow down because we are looking at the planets orbiting the sun from a certain vantage point, the Earth, and of course the Earth is also orbiting the sun at its own speed. So when we say a planet is slowing down or stationing retrograde, we are looking at it from our vantage point, from our subjectivity. So even though it's not true, objectively true, that a planet is moving backward from the astrological perspective, we would be foolish to not acknowledge the very sort of real psychological and energetic implications or upshots of retrogrades and planetary stations. So when a planet appears to be slowing down, there is no question, after so much observation, that the planet's energy becomes much more concentrated. And that's something that we see showing up in the natal chart as well. So when we are looking at planets in the natal chart, we also want to take note of their speed. Now, when a planet is in retrograde motion, it is traveling back over a degree range in the zodiac that it has already passed over. So the planet is revisiting these degrees. So from this sort of simple observation, which correlates to our experiences, retrograde planets are about revisiting, reflection, assimilation, and deepening. And for those of you who've been around here for a while, you may have heard me say on occasion that retrograde periods are about this reflection, assimilation, and deepening. So retrograde periods from the perspective of human consciousness are about revisiting, reflection, assimilation, and deepening relative to the planet that is retrograde. Now, at the time of this recording, Saturn and Pluto are both retrograde in Capricorn, and on a collective level, they are acting on the human consciousness in such a way where we are assimilating on deeper energetic levels the lessons having to do with these planets as they engage the lunar south node and as they move toward the exact conjunction. So retrograde periods give us the opportunity to assimilate lessons on deeper levels, and the sort of locus of operation of retrograde planets is at deeper levels within the human psyche. So they're operating at a deeper psychic level, shall we say. So when a planet is retrograde within a natal chart, meaning that a person was born when a given planet was retrograde in the sky, from an evolutionary perspective, it means that the individual is in a relationship of revisiting, reflecting, deepening, and assimilating relative to that retrograde planet. So if Venus is retrograde in the natal chart, for example, the sort of phase relationship that we are dealing with here is that on the evolutionary level, the person is just in this process of assimilating and deepening relative to Venus and their relationship to the Venus part of their psyche and life. Now, the second thing we notice with retrograde planets, sort of in keeping with all that we've just mentioned, is that I like to say that the energy of the planet that's retrograde sort of folds in on itself, and meaning that it is sort of more internally directed. So the orientation of the energy is shifted to be more inward, or let's say more internally focused. Or I actually want to say this a bit differently. So in relation to the retrograde planet, the person is taking their lead from their internal or interior terrain. That's the important thing with retrograde planets, that the person is taking their lead relative to that planet from their internal or interior terrain. All right, so let's look at some planets themselves here. Let's get into some guidelines in relation to some of the planets themselves, right? Mercury retrograde. So Mercury has to do with our thinking, perceiving, and communicative function or faculty. So when Mercury is retrograde in the natal chart, from an evolutionary perspective, the individual may be revisiting how they have perceived life. The individual may be in a process of deepening and assimilation of certain sorts of data or knowledge or perceptions. So people with Mercury retrograde are taking their lead from their inner world, their interior world, and for that reason, they may have their own very sort of specific ways of perceiving or communicating. So, or let's say that they have their own very particular way of thinking and perceiving. So from a sort of anecdotal perspective, and in talking to people who have Mercury retrograde, they report that they have a rich sort of inner perceptual life. They may be keen observers, and that their perceptions are sort of just more internally focused. Yeah. Now, Venus retrograde. Venus has to do with our approach to establishing relationships and connecting with others, our ideas of personal worth and value. So Venus has to do with the activities surrounding how we attract resources to ourselves, what gives us pleasure, our tastes, that sort of thing. So when Venus is retrograde in the natal chart, from an evolutionary perspective, the individual may be revisiting their approach to relationships or to personal worth and value, and even how they attract resources to themselves. So they may be deepening and assimilating soul lessons having to do with relationships, personal worth, value, and self-esteem, or let's say approaches to material security and resources. So because people with Venus retrograde are taking their lead, as we said, from their inner or interior world or terrain, where Venus is concerned, they may have a very specific internally led approach to the domain of their relationships or values, for example, right? So because their conceptions of value come from their inner world, their interior world, they may be sort of, let's say, out of step with consensus value systems, or the consensus value systems of the outer world. So for example, in relation to what they consider beautiful. So we may find that the Venus retrograde person's approach to worth and value comes strongly from within their own interior space, this sort of interior orientation, which is not focused so much on the outer or external world. This may mean that the Venus retrograde person operates differently from others in their approach to resources, their tastes, their preferences, their values, and their relationships. Yeah. Now, Mars retrograde. So in broad terms, Mars has to do with our faculty of self-assertion, initiative, and drive. It has to do with our approach to applying our energy toward the pursuit of our individual goals and agendas. So when Mars is retrograde in the natal chart, from an evolutionary perspective, the individual may be revisiting their approach to self-assertion and their methods of getting what they want. They are revisiting how they have applied their energy toward the fulfillment of their desires. So from a soul perspective, the question is, how might that person, how might they have gone about this question of self-assertion and getting what they want, pursuing their own goals? What facets of their approach to self-assertion need to be revisited and brought into more conscious navigation? So people with Mars retrograde may be deepening and assimilating lessons having to do with how they have used their assertion, courage, initiative, and also their motivation for taking action. Because people with Mars retrograde are taking their lead from the inner world, from their internal terrain where Mars is concerned, their motivation for taking action may be sort of out of step with or different from other people in the external world around them. So they may have a strong inner sense of drive and initiative that is operating almost independently of what is happening externally. Yeah. And when we think about Mars and when we look at the planetary glyph itself, we have an arrow pointing upward and outward, emphasizing the fact that Mars as an archetype is basically concerned with applying its energy outward in a direct or forceful way. So when Mars is retrograde, there can be a sort of shift of orientation in a sense. So Mars is folded in on itself. So a strong sense of interior drive and motivation. The sense of motivation and application of energy may be more contained. The person may even contain their anger to a certain degree. Anger, of course, being a psychological state of Mars. So Mars is just more directed inward. So we may see a strong internally led sense of desire. So self-motivated might be a good word to describe the energy here of Mars retrograde. All right, so Jupiter retrograde. Now Jupiter has to do with our interpretation of the world. So a Jupiter verb being to interpret. So when we interpret the world a certain way, we have a set of beliefs or opinions. Two more Jupiter words there, beliefs and opinions, how we interpret the world, what we think about the world that we live in, how we interpret it. So Jupiter has to do with how we connect to a higher order, a higher spiritual order, and the activities that result in personal expansion and opportunity. So the things that we do to expand our personal frame of reference, higher learning and traveling being the expressions of the Jupiter archetype. So when Jupiter is retrograde in the natal chart, from an evolutionary perspective, the individual may be revisiting how they have interpreted the world, their frame of reference, their beliefs, their interpretation of reality. So they may be deepening and assimilating lessons having to do with their relationship to Jupiter and all that Jupiter governs in their lives. So They may be in a process of bringing certain aspects of their relationship to Jupiter into more conscious navigation by revisiting and deepening and relearning, let's say. So because people with Jupiter retrograde are taking their lead from their inner world or inner terrain where Jupiter is concerned, we may find that their interpretation of the world is more internally directed. Their beliefs and approach to spirituality are coming more from within themselves and may tend to be more out of step with the beliefs and interpretations that other people have, the beliefs and the interpretations of reality that other people may hold, other people external to them may hold. So because Jupiter retrograde people are taking their lead from within where their spiritual or religious orientation, Jupiter, is concerned, you may find that they walk their own individual spiritual path that is more internally than externally directed. And as I observe my own life, that has certainly held true for me, very, very true for me, a strong internally led private terrain of beliefs, spiritual beliefs, or interpretations of reality that I'm not necessarily looking for the outside world of other people to validate, that kind of thing. So for me, it has tended to mean that I have a very strong inner sense of grace. Again, grace being a Jupiterian sort of state of being, and a strong inner sense of faith and confidence in myself and the universe and things kind of working out that is often in, let's say, direct contravention of what other people in my life may feel. Again, check your chart. This may be amplified for me because my Titus solar aspect is actually a trine to Jupiter. So in any case, where the outer planets are concerned, Jupiter on out, we can know that they are about to slow down and change direction when the Sun is trine these planets. So my Sun is in a very tight trine with a slow, powerful, concentrated Jupiter. So regardless, retrograde Jupiter is important in terms of my overall identity and self-expression, Sun. So you want to check the significance of these retrogrades in relation to how these planets are aspected in your individual chart. So in assessing retrograde planets in your chart, here's the sort of rubric to work with. You know, which planet is retrograde, which planets are retrograde, and what psychological functions does this retrograde planet represent? So for example, Mercury, thinking, perceiving, communicating. So what facets of this psychological function or dimension of my life am I learning to bring into more conscious navigation by revisiting, assimilating, or deepening certain lessons? As I observe myself, third question, as I observe myself, how am I directing my energy or directing this energy, the energy of this planet? In relation to this retrograde planet, in what ways am I taking my lead more from my internal world or my inner terrain? So for the outer planets, Jupiter on out, you would make a note of their relationship to your Sun. If an outer planet is opposite the Sun, it is retrograde. So if it is trine the Sun, the planet has slowed down and is about to change direction, about to be retrograde or about to be in direct motion. So because they are in aspect to the Sun, these planets are already directly related to your core self-expression, yes? So of course, if you need help in unpacking and understanding retrograde planets in the context of your chart and in the context of your life experience, I am available for private astrological counseling consultations, which can be accessed from my website, and links to that are in the description box below. So hope this was helpful, and until next time, talk soon. Bye.